Hello and welcome to Written in Uncertainty, an Elder Scrolls YouTube channel sat firmly in the grey maybe of Tamriel. My name is Aramithius, and today we're carrying on our close reading of the Monomyth with a look at the text called the Mythic Aurbis, which is a text from the Syzyx. I will begin first of all, though, by correcting something that I managed to entirely miss out of last episode's recording, that the title of the book overall, the Monomyth, is a reference to a work by Joseph Campbell. He wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces in, I think it was the 30s or so, and it was basically about how lots of mythic narratives all follow the same pattern, about how a hero receives a call to action, who then resists the call, then leaves and goes on an adventure, goes on various trials, meets various characters that help him save it, and then he returns changed to his original place, having defeated his main opponent. That's not quite the monomyth that this text is talking about, but it is relevant because what Campbell was trying to do was synthesize various myth patterns into one, and think about how lots of mythic tales from lots of different traditions do actually have the same structure because of this underlying archetype. What the monomyth, the religious text in the Elder Scrolls, is trying to do is something very similar with how it looks at the gods. It's trying to reconcile how all the different events and the various pantheons fit together and essentially tell the same story from different angles. And this particular one, the Myth of the Aurbis, is trying to do that to an even greater degree, which is an interesting thing to look at, because to me it almost winds up being a mush of not very much at all. So if we kick off, we've got this interesting little subtitle and preface to it. Subtitled The Syzyx Compensation, Mythic Aurbis was an attempt by Artaeum apologists to explain the basics of Aldmeri religion to Uriel V in the early, glorious part of his reign. It quietly avoided any blame or bias against the Locan concept, which was still held in esteem by the Cyrodiils as Shazar, the missing sibling of the divines. Despite this, the Syzygy still give a nice summary of the Elder view, and it will serve our purpose here. This version comes from the archives of the Imperial Seminary from the handwritten notes of an unknown scribe. So with that context in mind, it's worth bearing in mind that the myth we're about to hear is something that is presented by elves to start off with, Artaeum apologists, the early Syzyx, who already diverge from the broadly Aldmeri view and have a difference in view in theology about that. So you're getting them trying to talk about something they don't entirely agree on to someone else and trying to make it sound palatable to this all-powerful figure. So they're likely to spin it and make it sound quite reasonable. It already says that it quietly avoids any blame on the Locan concept, and you'll see how, as we go through it, they kind of muddy the waters and say, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be the other. And then in addition to that, we've then got it being written down by someone whose name we don't even know, and it being filed away somewhere. So this is not the myth as it is in its natural state, but that's something to be very aware of. And it's also something that's trying to hedge. We talked about how the monomyth text as a whole, when it's talking about the dragon god and the time god, is almost aiming at a syncretic view of the pantheons. This text is doing that on steroids. It's trying to make everything seem different to the established view, but also not offensive to the established view, which means that it gets very broad outlines done and right, but the details are a little basically. Mythic Aurbis exists, and has existed from time without measure, as a fanciful, unnatural realm. My question with this is why it's an unnatural realm. It's talking about the whole of existence. How is the whole of existence unnatural? There was some talk by Michael Kirkbride when he's talked about what Nirn is. The word posse points and imposse points comes up. And there's some things that get highlighted in the Dwemer view about how the world is impossible and doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think that's what's being talked about here, but I'm not totally sure. It feels like it's trying to say that the world as it is should have been something else, but we don't really know what from this text. Aurbis is used to connote the imperceptible penumbra, the grey centre between the is-not of Anu and Padme. It contains the multitude realms of Aetherius and Oblivion, as well as other, less structured forms. So we've also got, in addition to thinking about this is an unnatural place, which isn't how we understand things, we've got the Aurbis as the centre, as the maybe. That's referring to the grey maybe term that is used in quite a few places, but it also makes clear that the maybe is not the is not of Anu Padme. So Anu and Padme as distinct from their interplay is not what they're talking about here. You've got the two primal forces, and only the area where they mix is the Aurbis. The other thing that interests me here is the talk of other, less structured forms. We've got the idea of Aetherius and Oblivion as well established, where the gods and demons live. If you go with the imperial belief, the gods rule in Aetherius and the demons of Oblivion are the Daedra. But that's not even the right picture there, but what are the other forms here? We don't really get a lot of information from this text, but the closest thing we can possibly talk about from other texts is the talk of the Void, which is where Padme and potentially Sithis are, if you look at a few other texts. But they're not really entities, if you like, in the traditional sense of it, and there's certainly not much in the way of structure in those places. The Void is portrayed as a place of nothingness, and Sithis is a being of entropy rather than structure. So I don't know, but that's the only possibility that I can see at this point. The magical beings of Mythic Aurbis live for a long time and have complex narrative lives, creating the patterns of myth. These are the Etarda, basically. These are the spirits that, in other tales, persist between cycles of the world and will go on to form the gods and demons of the various pantheons. And they have complex narrative lives outside of the world. So, in addition to the time and cycles of the world, we've also got a second order of narrative going on here, that the time that is flowing on in between worlds is still a continuous narrative. There's a few texts out there that will make nods to this, not many of them that you'll find within the games, quite a bit of them in the stuff that gets put out for the Argonian mythologies in the Elder Scrolls Online. The Children of the Root talks about cycles, which I think is also to do with different cycles of the world and different kalpas and the progression that goes on beyond that. But you can check out my video on that I've already done to check out my views on that one. And we've also got the patterns of myth going on here. The patterns of myth are not identified with the magical beings of the Mythic Aurbis, which are the spirits, the gods and demons. The patterns of myth seem to exist beyond those spirits. So my question is, are the gods reacting to a more primal pattern? Are they performing roles which have already been pre-assigned to them through the nature of the Aurbis itself, rather than being their own beings, if you like? This ties in a bit with Jungian psychology, the idea that there are certain archetypes in the human subconscious that people will try to play out. And so my question is, if we've got the patterns of myth existing before the magical beings, then are the magical beings, are the Etarda, playing out patterns that exist before them, which ultimately makes the whole idea of repeating patterns and kalpas and so on much more concrete because you've already got these underlying patterns. These are spirits made from bits of the immortal polarity. The first of these was Akatosh the Time Dragon, whose formation made it easier for other spirits to structure themselves. Gods and demons form and reform and procreate. And so we have Akatosh landing and creating time and making everything a nice structured narrative. It kind of says that the magical beings were created before that point, if there is a before, but it's a little difficult to get away from the notion of time in how we think about things. It almost makes me think that, again, thinking back to the Anuad, that there's a time at the Anu Padme level, not necessarily just starting with Akatosh, which is kind of a quasi-Kantian way of looking at things. Immanuel Kant posited the idea that time was transcendental, that time was totally independent of everything else, that we couldn't imagine anything, you couldn't conceive of anything without time. You also couldn't conceive of anything without space, but time's the focus here. But the idea that you couldn't think of anything without there being a flow of time meant that time was entirely separate from your perceptions of anything. And I'm just wondering whether this way of thinking about the Aurbis is putting that sort of idea across, that not necessarily time, but change is kind of key here, that because it's a Psijic point of view and the Psijics like change and think it's a prime mover of a thing, that change is something that is always there, is always a constant, that change is transcendental in the way that Kant thought space and time were. Finally, the magical beings of Mythic Aurbis told the ultimate story, that of their own death. For some, this was an artistic transfiguration into the concrete, non-magical substance of the world. For others, this was a war in which all was slain, their bodies becoming the substance of the world. For yet others, this was a romantic marriage and parenthood, with the parent spirits naturally having to die and give way to the succeeding mortal races. And the beings of the Mythic Aurbis telling their ultimate story, telling about their own death, is where we get hints of Tolkien in this. The way that Tolkien frames his legendarium is in terms of a song, and that the Ainur, before creation starts in Tolkien's narrative, have already sung out the patterns of everything. So is this narrative saying that the magical beings are telling their own story of their own death, of the fate of the world, before the world even begins? I'm not really sure. It doesn't have a concrete point where it says this is where the world starts, apart from that, so there's part of me thinking it's just wordy metaphor, but it did make my ears prick up slightly. The rest of the passage is where we start to get into the syncretism of this book. It kind of fudges the whole notion of creation. It gives you a load of different perspectives. It's a war, it's people becoming parents, and it becoming a natural process, and then you've got an artistic transfiguration as well. They completely gloss over any kind of normative question over what the world is. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it just happens, and here's several ways in which it could happen. I haven't seen the marriage metaphor anywhere else, though, I must admit, that it's the idea of marriage and parenthood being a natural thing and the natural pattern of the world isn't something we see anywhere else, which I thought was a little curious. The agent of the communal decision was Lorcan, whom most early myths vilify as a trickster and a deceiver. More sympathetic versions of this story point out Lorcan as being the reason the mortal plane exists at all. And this is a summary of some of the stuff that came up in the previous section of the book. That Lorcan is either tricking or persuading the Etada to create the mortal plane. The interesting thing for me is that it says most early myths vilify Lorcan as a trickster and a deceiver. But if you think back, the most of early myths that we have are from elves. We have records of the Dwemer, we have records from people leaving Somerset and scouting out Tamriel before there's written record of life on Tamriel at all. So the early myths vilifying Lorkhand as a trickster and a deceiver is a way of saying most of the early myths are elvish, in my opinion. The magical beings create the races of the mortal Aurbis in their own image, either consciously as artists and craftsmen, or as the fecund, rotting matter out of which mortals sprung forth, or in a variety of other analogical senses. And I think, again, we have a lot of Psijic diplomacy going on here. We've got the mortal races emerging in a way that doesn't really matter. It could be anything, really. I mean, make up your own story, I don't mind. That's the sense I get from that passage. It almost feels irresponsible. It's not, well, we don't really know what happened. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this. It's just fudging it to the point of where it's not relevant. The key thing for me in this one is that there's no note of descent here. It's all being created. The magical beings created the mortal races in their own image, which is pretty biblical in its language. And it doesn't talk about them being descended. It kind of glosses over the passage above that talks about marriage and parenthood and all that, which I do find slightly interesting, particularly as this is a Psijic text, because we have the book The Old Ways talking about the Psijic worldview as presenting the spirits of this world as the spirits of everyone's ancestors, and that's not an option here, which is kind of curious, and especially if this is a Psijic trying to present an Aldmeri perspective. The idea that they're not descended is a huge oversight if you're trying to look at this as a Moorish narrative. The magical beings then, having died, became the Etarda. The Etarda are the things perceived and revered by the mortals as gods, spirits, or geniuses of Aurbis. Through their deaths, these magical beings separated themselves in nature from the other magical beings of the unnatural realms. So this is the pattern of creation and the telling of the Etarda becoming the spirits of the natural world. One of the things that I do find a little curious is that this points out that the spirits aren't Etarda until after they've died. You don't have the Etarda being a class that encompasses Aedra, Daedra, and Magna Gei, like most myths seem to present. You just have the Etarda being the ones that are involved in the creation of Mundus. So in this text, it's treating the Etarda and the Aedra as the same thing, which is a little interesting. And we also have the note here of the geniuses of Aurbis. That isn't a way you describe a god generally. It's a way you talk about an exceptional being of any stripe, particularly of mortals. And so, is this text hinting that you can potentially become an Etarda by being really good at what you do, as reaching some kind of apotheosis? I don't honestly know, although thinking about the other texts around this time, we have the notion of things like Chezarines, and Zurin Arctis comes up as an avatar of Magnus in, I think, Tamrielic lore. I'll be linking that in the comments and in the text of this video. But those differences aside, I think that might be what that's referring to. And it also hints at the idea that mortals can become gods, which again is a difference from the standard Aldmeri view of things, that all beings whatsoever can become gods. It is totally in line with the Psijic view that the Aedra and the Daedra are beings that achieved great things and then went on to be better things in the spirit plane. And this is also where we have the first divide between the mortal and the immortal at this point. The magical beings separating themselves in nature from the other magical beings. It's the Aedra deliberately cutting part of themselves off to become mortal, to be part of the mortal world. The Daedra were created at this time also, being spirits and gods more attuned to oblivion, or that realm closer to the void of Padme. This act is the dawn of the Mythic Era. It has been perceived by the earliest mortals in many different ways, either as a joyous second creation, or, especially by the elves, as a painful fracturing from the divine. The originator of this event is always Locarno. And so we end with another piece of trying to mash everything together and say that it doesn't really matter. It's another attempt to say that, well, it could be this way or it could be the other way. Which, I don't know, I kind of want the Psijics to take a position on this one. Because they take some really interesting views elsewhere, but just not when they're talking to a Mannish emperor. I can kind of understand their sense of self-preservation there, but I want something a bit more definite. Can we please have some colours pinned to the mast here? It also talks about how the Daedra were created at this point as well, and how they are perceived to be more attuned to the void of Padme, and it doesn't make them the same as Oblivion, which is worth noting here, that they are more attuned to Oblivion, which is kind of interesting in its way, because it implies that there's bits of Oblivion that are not to do with the Daedra, because otherwise they would have made the whole place out of themselves, and they did make parts of it out of themselves. You have the Daedric planes being made from the substance of the princes, if you follow some of the other myths that we have. But that's not the whole of the story here. We've got bits of Oblivion that are unaligned and uncreated. There's a handful of references to this in other texts. The plane of Infernus, where fire atronachs come from, is one plane that's not related to a prince somehow, but it also means that the substance of Oblivion has to be something different from the substance of the Aurbis and of Aetherius, purely by virtue of being Oblivion, rather than being the creation of the spirits and gods more attuned to the void, or more attuned to Oblivion. In this text, the princes and Oblivion are not synonymous here. We've also got the Mythic Era being related to the Merethic. You will see in some texts that the Mythic Era will sometimes be used to talk about both the Merethic and the Dawn Era, but here it's explicitly called out as being the Merethic. Just something to bear in mind when thinking about other texts as we look at those. And on that note of trying to squish everything together into one account and one carefully crafted, this is how we think it is, but please don't be offended, here's your views mixed in as well portion, that's how this particular part of the monomyth ends. And that's it for our look through this particular tale of how the mortal plane and the Aurbis came to be. If you've enjoyed this, please do consider subscribing, and if you want to see more about this, including how my thought process works, please do consider becoming my patron. There will be a button for Patreon flashing up at the end of this video or in the links. Or if you just want to say thank you very much for having spent an enjoyable half hour, then please do head over to Ko-fi and drop me enough for a cup of coffee while I'm researching my next set of notes, which will be the Yokudan creation myth next time. So join us next week as we look into the myth of Satakal and the world skin. Until then, this video remains a letter written in uncertainty. You've been listening to Written in Uncertainty, a podcast written and presented by Aramithius. The music for this podcast has been kindly provided by Jan Glembotsky. Check them out on SoundCloud under Songs from the Lost Land, and I'll see you next time.